So where were we?
They're being reprimanded. How did God reprimand the Israelites? He sent a famine. Due to this famine, Elimelech, one of the main characters in our story early on, decided to do what? He decided to retreat. He decided to run away from God's reprimand. He retreated to where? Moab. Are they supposed to go to Moab? No. But he went there anyway. He retreated to Moab, trying to keep his family alive. And over time, all the male members of his family are dead. So he's trying to escape death, and he goes and finds it. So as these widows try to figure out what they're going to do with the rest of their lives, they resolve themselves to return to Bethlehem. Right? And so, long story short, there's a lot of dialogue, and we end up with just Ruth and Naomi coming back to Bethlehem. Naomi was calling herself Mara because she felt so bittered in her life. And so they returned to Bethlehem, and when they get there, as it just happened to happen, remember? Yeah, right. She started gleaning in the fields of a man named Boaz. And so Naomi last week made her request through Ruth, and we have a budding romance relationship. That's where we left off last week. Now, I used something last week, and I didn't necessarily explain it, so some of you may have gotten it, and some of you may have not gotten it. But I want to introduce you to a young lady. Her name is Sadie Hawkins. And she's from a comic strip by Al Cap. You remember? And she's not a looker. She's not a looker. She's a bit of a spinster. And she's tired of waiting on a man. So she goes to her dad and says, look, I'm tired of waiting on a man. And he says, well, just be patient. Be patient. Somebody will come along. And 15 years later, she's still waiting on a man. And so she goes to her daddy and says, look, Daddy, if I don't have a man, I'm going to live with you forever. He says, oh, I got to come up with something. Right? So he instituted something called Sadie Hawkins Day. And he took Sadie out there, beautiful thing that she was, and he lined up all the bachelors in town. He gave them a 10-second head start, and then he sent her chasing them. And if she caught one of them, they had to go in front of Mary and Sam for a shotgun wedding. Well, she was far quicker than she was cute. And she caught one, and she was married. And the girls of that village loved it, town loved it so much, they instituted it yearly so that all the spinsters could have a wife. Now, here's the reason I use that illustration. Think about what Ruth went through and what she did last week. She goes to the threshing floor where the men are. She hides. She waits for Boaz to lay down to sleep. She sneaks in. She uncovers his feet. She lies down. He wakes up. Who's there? It's me, your handmaiden, right? Spread your wing over me, kinsman redeemer. So in essence, here's what she did. She chased Boaz down. She cornered him. And then she asked him to marry her. Pretty, right? We talked about it last week. So there was the point of that illustration. Today we'll close out in chapter 4, and we're going to talk about redemption and reward. This whole story is built to this point, and this is a truly beautiful, beautiful story and a beautiful chapter. And we'll start out by looking at this redemptive process that we see in Ruth. We'll read 1 through 12 together if you're with me in Ruth 4. Beginning in verse 1, it says this. Boaz went to the gate of the town and sat down there. Soon the family redeemer Boaz had spoken about came by, and Boaz says, come over here and sit down. So we went over and sat down. Then Boaz took 10 men of the town's elders and said, sit here, and they sat down. And he said to the redeemer, Naomi, who has returned from the territory of Moab, is selling the portion of the field that belonged to her brother Elimelech. I thought I should inform you, buy it back in the presence of those seated here, and the presence of the elders of my people. If you want to redeem it, do it. But if you do not want to redeem it, tell me so that I will know. Because there isn't anyone other than you to redeem it, and I am next after you. I want to redeem it, he answered. Then Boaz says, on the day you buy the field from Naomi, you will acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the deceased man, to perpetuate the man's name on his property. The redeemer replied, I can't redeem it myself, or I will ruin my inheritance. Take my right of redemption, because I can't redeem it. At an earlier period in Israel, a man removed his sandal and gave it to the other party in order to make any matter legally binding concerning the right of redemption or the exchange of property. This was the method of legally binding a transaction in Israel. So the Redeemer removed his sandal and said to Boaz, buy back the property yourself. Boaz said to the elders of all the people, "You are witnesses today that I am buying from Naomi everything that belonged to Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife to perpetuate the deceased man's name on his property, so that his name will not disappear among his relatives or from the gate of his hometown. You are witnesses today." Now, this is pretty cool. In some translations, at the beginning of this chapter of 4, it has the word meanwhile. How many of you have meanwhile at the beginning of 4 in your translation? Okay. There are those that believe, and it's kind of cool to think that it might be so, that at the end of chapter 3, in verse 18, where he says, "Wait, I will not let the day go on until I resolve this," he just, meanwhile, she's waiting, he goes straight to the town gate to try to put this all together. So what we see is he didn't hesitate a moment. He went and he acted immediately. Now, he went to the town gate. For a long time, that seemed kind of odd to me, and he sat down and waited. And some of you are aware, and some of you probably aren't, but God really blessed me a couple of years ago to go take a study. I did a study semester in Israel. It was awesome. And while I was over there, I got to see some really cool places. And gates of the ancient cities were really critical, which I'm sure you know, but they were probably a little more critical than what we may have thought. We went to this village called Laish, right? This little town called Laish. You can see it here. And that's the gate of Laish. Now, a lot of these villages that were a little bit larger, they would have a gate within a gate. Works kind of like locks on a dam. So when you went in the first gate, right, they would close it and make sure you were no threat. Then they would open the next gate and they would let you progress through the town. Now, once you got through the gate, there would be this little courtyard inside where these town elders would gather. So you walk in there and there's this place that looks kind of like this. And these elders would sit together and they would gather in one place on these seats. And they would sit in judgment of the local issues. So they would have a seat like that, and the chief elder would sit there, and the rest of them would sit around it, and they would rule on the issues of the town. Now, Boaz goes there, he has them all sit down, and he says, "Look, I'm waiting for the kinsman redeemer to come by." He comes by, he grabs him, he says, "Hey, come over and sit down." The guy agrees, he comes over and sits down, pulls up his dress, sits down, and Boaz begins his negotiation. He elicited 10 elders to come and sit in judgment so that it would be legal. And here's how he opened his negotiation. He opened it with the facts. He says, "Naomi's back from Moab." Everybody probably knew that. She's selling a piece of Elimelech's land. Why is this not Mahlon's land? Anyone know? If you've read The Prodigal, you could probably figure it out. The father passed down the land to the firstborn when he passed. And so Elimelech died out of the country, and there was no way at that point for him to pass it on. And he says, "I wanted to inform you before these witnesses that if you want to redeem the land of Elimelech, what she's selling, then buy it. If not, let me know. I'm next in line." So the kinsman's response was, "Okay, I'll redeem it. Right? God ain't making no more time. God ain't making no more dirt. I'll take the dirt." Right? He goes, "Oh yeah, there's one other thing. If you take the dirt, you have to marry Ruth." And then he puts in there what? The Moabitess. You've got to marry Ruth, the Moabitess, to wife, because you have to continue Mahlon's name. Now that brings us to the point of the story, if you ask me, the concept of a kinsman redeemer. How many of you have heard this phrase before? Kinsman redeemer. Very good. Go well. All right. A kinsman redeemer was one that was charged with the duty of restoring the rights of another or avenging his wrong. So it was a bigger deal than just a man's name. We'll talk about that in a moment. But his job was to come to the rescue. The kinsman redeemer was to come to the rescue of his relatives in times of crisis. And here it's referring to what's called the law of lineage. The law of lineage. I'm going to put it on the screen for you, but I'm going to read it from here. In the book of Deuteronomy, it talks briefly about this in chapter 25. I'm in 5 and 6 that says this. "When brothers live on the same property and one of them dies without a son, the wife of the dead man may not marry a stranger outside the family. Her brother-in-law is to take her as his wife, have relations with her, and perform the duty of a brother-in-law for her. The first son she bears will carry on the name of the dead brother, so his name will not be blotted out from Israel." Make sense? So we have this brother-in-law. Right? I've often wondered if this is where that expression originated. We have a brother-in-law whose responsibility as a kinsman is to come in and rescue. So this kinsman, who's a little bit closer than Boaz, his response is, oh no, that changes everything. Oh, I got to take the Moabitess? I'll take no for 500, Alex, right? No, I don't think I'll do that. Because he says what? He says, look, that's going to ruin my inheritance if I do that. Well, if you've been with us all 5 weeks, you know exactly what that means. How is it going to ruin his inheritance? To take on a Moabite wife was to curse yourself to the 10th generation. You couldn't even go to the assembly. For us, it would be like, look, for 10 generations, you're not allowed to go to church. You can't get in. And he says, oh man, I can't do that. I'll ruin my inheritance for myself and for my sons and their sons. So he says, you do it, I just can't. Can't do it. So he takes off his sandal. That's nice. Give me a cup of coffee or something. Stanky old sandal. You know what's it? They're walking around with them camels and everything over there. He gives him his sandal, gives it to Boaz, and he says, you buy it yourself. Or in essence, you act as kinsman redeemer. You rescue the family. Now, this sandal closing the deal thing seems so strange to me. How many of you agree? Now, one little illustration I'll give you. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Turkey. Anybody ever been, well, the Middle East? Over there, it's really shameful to show the bottom of your foot to a man. So when you sit, you have to be careful how you cross your legs. Right? You're not allowed to show them the bottom of your feet. Now, I've wondered now that I've studied this a little bit more, if maybe there's a tie in the Middle East to this. But back then, land was parceled out by the distance one could walk in a day, a week, a month, right? However far you could walk in that amount of time was how the land was parceled out. So it's believed that that's how this sandal process came to be used in transactions, because it illustrated how far, right, you walked. And it ended up even being used in those of the kinsman redeemer. If you're still reading from Deuteronomy, let me read the next 2 verses. It say this: but if the man doesn't want to marry his sister-in-law, she is to go to the elders at the city gate and say, my brother-in-law refuses to preserve his brother's name in Israel. He isn't willing to perform the duty of a brother-in-law for me. The elders of the city will summon him and speak with him. If he persists and says, I don't want to marry her, then his sister-in-law will go up to him in the sight of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, and spit in his face. Then she will declare, this is what is done to a man who will not build up his brother's house, and his name in Israel will be built by the house of the man whose sandal will not be built by the man whose sandal was removed. So, crazy, odd, it's the way it worked. I don't know what to tell you. I'm just glad it don't work like that over here, because, I don't know. Personally, there's some bad things you could do to me. I mean, you live a little bit of life, you get to be near 50, you've had some roughs, and if you live like me, you've had some really rough turns, right? I can't think of anything anybody could do worse than spit in my face. Take my sandal, you can have my rainbow, you can have a flip-flop, or whatever you do, don't spit in my face. But that's the way it worked. So here's what happens. Boaz closed the deal, right? He says to all the people, have you ever heard me use the expression, I call heaven and earth as witnesses? Right? It's a very biblical principle, which pretty much says everybody in the universe needs to witness what we're doing here. We're going to cut a covenant. And he says, I want all of you to act as witnesses of this covenant I am about to cut. He says, I'm redeeming all of it. I'm going to redeem it all. I'm going to act as a kinsman redeemer for all. I'm going to take care of the land that was Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion's. I'm going to extend Mahlon's name. And I'm going to bring Naomi, the mother-in-law, under my wing. And then he says, again, you're witnesses to all this, right? Now, this is our 5th instance of a theological significance. We see God's responsibility in Boaz. We talked about how God will use us as his hands and feet. He will use us to show his responsibility to the people in our circles of influence, but he also shows us the irresponsibility or the unwillingness of the kinsman redeemer. So we see God making a way on behalf of Ruth. Now, if you look at verses 11 and 12, let's go back to that and read those. I intentionally left those off. It says this: all the people who were at the city gate, including the elders, said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is entering your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built the house of Israel. May you be powerful in Ephrathah, and your name well known in Bethlehem. May your house become like the house of Perez, the son of Tamar, that was born to Judah, because of the offspring the Lord will give you in this young woman. That's a pretty cool blessing, right? Let's see if we can figure it out. So the witnesses respond to Boaz by this blessing, and they confirmed the witness. They said, yep, we're confirming our witness. Here's the blessing on your household. Now, this was kind of like a global blessing. They blessed everything. They blessed from top to bottom, from soup to nuts. They say, may the woman in your house, who is Ruth, may Ruth be like Rachel and Leah. Who are Rachel and Leah? Those are the mothers of most of Israel, right? Yeah, they're the wives of Jacob who became Israel. They're the moms of most of the children of Israel. And then she says, may you, Boaz, be mighty in Ephratah, which is sort of like the state around Bethlehem. They're sort of used and interspersed together, but they want him to be a mighty man. They also want his name to be famous in Bethlehem. And then they say, may your house be like Perez. Who is that? Who is Perez? Anybody know? I'm going to give you a very quick illustration, but man, go out and later read Genesis 38, because there's a very good picture of this kinsman-redeemer process and what happens when a man didn't do it and how big a drama it could turn into. But essentially, this boy Perez was born to Tamar in Judah. Judah had a son who married a woman named Tamar. He was evil in God's sight, so before a child could be born, God killed him. And so Judah says to the girl, look, I tell you what, wait till my younger son gets old enough, you marry him, he can be the kinsman-redeemer, and we'll continue your family line. With me? Well, time, that didn't happen. She finds out that Judah's going to be taking a trip. She sneaks off there, dresses herself up like one of the prostitutes in the temple, and sneaks him. They have a transaction. He pretty much decides he wants to hire her. Long story short, he hasn't got no money. And he says, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a goat. But I ain't got a goat. What do you need is an IOU. So he gave her a signet ring, a cord, and some other things so that when he came back, he could give her the goat. You remember the story? Well, here's the thing. He goes home, gets the goat, and comes back. She's not there. Not only is she not there, everybody around there says, oh, no, there's never been a prostitute around here that does that. He says, well, whatever we do, let's go home and take the goat. Let her have the stuff because we'll be embarrassed. I was with a prostitute that ain't a prostitute. What in the world, right? So she ends up having a child named Perez, right? And long story short, it gets back to him what happened. She's pregnant. She turns up pregnant. He's going to go kill her. He's going to burn her. And she gets there, and he gets there, and she says, well, go tell him the man that gave me this stuff is the father of his child. She sent his stuff out to him. Yeah, man. She's sneaky like that. And he says, well, she's more righteous than me. And the boy's name was Perez. That's where this comes from. Now, why would they bless this household and say, why don't you be like Perez, when they could have said Benjamin? Or there was a lot of big tribes, right? Why did they say Perez? How did he come about? So a kinsman-redeemer, right? So they're saying, may your process of this kinsman-redeemer be just as big as Perez's line, which we're going to find out is pretty big. So there's the redemption process in a flyover. We're going to close it all up together. Let's look at this reward that we have here. 13 to 17. Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He slept with her, and the Lord granted conception to her, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you without a family redeemer today. May his name become well known in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. Indeed, your daughter-in-law, whose love to you is better than 7 sons, has given birth to him. And Naomi took the child, placed him on her lap, and became his nanny. And the neighbor women said, a son has been born to Naomi, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So, look at this reward. From what I can tell, it's sort of a rags to riches story, isn't it? Ruth's as low as you can go. And God's brought her into this redemptive process and given her everything. Let's look at Ruth's reward for a second. It's a complete reversal of chapter 1. You remember everything that was lost in chapter 1? It's all replaced now. She's given a son. She's given a spouse first, then a son. That son is going to be a sovereign, the first great king of, the first great king of Israel, who we've talked about before. And from that line, we also know that there will come a Savior. So she got a spouse, a son, a sovereign, and a Savior. So we're talking about this reward and this renewal. And that the cool thing about it, any grandmoms in here? Did you notice how Naomi shared in that too? Naomi shared in this process along with Ruth. It's pretty cool. All the women in town who, when she got back, said, is that even Naomi? She said, nope, I'm Mara. I'm bitter. Life stinks. God's judging me. Don't talk to me. And they say of her this blessing. Praise the Lord for your family redemption. May your grandson be famous in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain it. Now, girls, catch this. I don't know of another place in the Bible where this expression is used, and this is extraordinary language. She says, may Ruth be better to you than 7 sons. That's a big deal. That's a really, really big deal, because if you remember, in the Middle East, everything's about land and lineage, land and sons, right? The land goes down through the sons, which is why we have the kinsman redeemer in the first place. And she says, you know what? Ruth's better than 7 sons. I tend to agree with her, don't you? Ruth's an amazing girl. And then we have this awesome picture, right? Here she is, bouncing little Obed on her knee. She's the nanny for this child who she was certain would never come, holding him on her lap. That's a great picture as we go into the holidays. And they said, a son has been born to Naomi. Who had the baby? That's convenient. Ruth gives birth and they give credit to Naomi for the baby. That's pretty good, isn't it? But either way, they said, name him Obed. What does Obed mean? Servant. Name him Obed, servant. Now we're going to see God's revelation to close. And these are the family records for Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram, and Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. Right? So what we're seeing here, when we talked about why Ruth was written, one of the main possibilities to a Jew was, well, it's validating David's right to kingship. There it is. There's David's right to kingship. But it says the lineage is coming through Boaz. I thought he was supposed to be taking care of Mahlon's name. Kind of interesting. I've thought about it. I don't have an answer, but I noticed it and I thought it was something. But we have from Obed to Jesse to David. Now, if you were to go to the New Testament and you were to read the lineage of Jesus, which we're not going to do today because, right, this is so perfect, it's going to lead us right into Advent next week. And we're going to look at this stuff as it affects Jesus in Bethlehem. But there are 5 women in Jesus' line. Girls, to have 1 woman in your line would have been extraordinary. This was a purchase. Ruth was purchased. It's a beautiful story, but let's call it what it is. She's property. Women are just about right. There are 5 women in Jesus' lineage, and all of them have questionable credentials. All of them are the kind of girls you wouldn't tell your son to date, right? You got Tamar. We just talked about her. She had incest with her father-in-law. Then you got Rahab. Remember Rahab? What is she? She's a pagan harlot. You got Ruth. Oh my goodness. She's a She's a product of incest between a father and a daughter. Holy moly. You got Bathsheba. She's an adulteress. And some of you may wonder, well, why did Stuart put Mary on the list? Because to a Jew, she was a fornicator. And at first she was to Joseph too. He's going to put her away privately because he's a good guy, but to him, she stepped out on the betrothal. She should have been stoned. 5 women. Now, listen, y'all, we all have flaws. I certainly do. And we all do, just like these women did. But the beautiful thing about it is, God can use us just like He used them. But only with this concept of redemption that we're talking about. And I want you to write something down. You might as well say that redemption is kind of like ransom, which is kind of like atonement. They all sort of mean the same thing. They're all kind of synonymous. And the only way you can get redemption and ransom and atonement is through a sacrifice. There has to be a sacrifice. The word is korban, and the root of that word comes from a word that actually means to come near or to draw close. So in other words, this concept of sacrifice really means come close, draw near. Well, what does that got to do with it? These are acts that will cleanse a sinner so that he can draw near or come close to God. That's what a sacrifice is. Y'all probably knew that, right? Sacrifice requires what? Blood. Thank you, Miss Hetty. Sacrifice has to have blood in it. That's God's currency in His economy. For the life of a creature is in the blood. And I have appointed it to you to make atonement on the altar for your lives, since it is the lifeblood that makes atonement. According to the law, almost everything is purified with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. So blood is God's currency. Have y'all ever heard of Yom Kippur, the Jewish holiday? Do you know what that is? That's the Day of Atonement. I like it because it has this process in it, or this concept in it, that I think is the coolest thing ever. It's got the scapegoat concept in it. You ever heard of a scapegoat? Isn't that the coolest thing you ever heard of? Maybe you're like, I've heard the word, but I don't know what it means. Let's tell you real quick. At the same time I was in Israel,
And you may say, Stuart, what was the most impressive place you went to? And they were all different for everybody else. Some of them, it was going to the Garden Tomb. Some of them, it was going to that Church of the Nativity and seeing that beautiful, and for others, it was the Garden of Gethsemane, and for some, it's Mount of Olives, right? I mean, everything was cool. Everybody had different places that really affected him, but something just hit me when I was at a place called Shiloh. Shiloh just struck me because God spoke to me there, and he let me see that at one point back in history, his actual Shekinah glory, the actual glory of God, came down and resided right there in Shiloh on that mountain. Right? Here's a picture of Shiloh. That's from where they believe that the tabernacle sat, looking east, which is where you look for the Savior's return. Here's another one. Look at that. They're digging that thing up. I can't wait to go back and see what they found over there. So here's what happened in this process of atonement, this Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. At this point, it was in Shiloh because David is yet to come along. David's not born yet, and until David comes along, Jerusalem's a pagan city. Now, we've got Melchizedek in there at some point, but he has to go take the city back. So here's what happened. The priest washed really, really good, and he put on his special clothes, his going to church clothes. You know, the ones you get a whooping for if you get grass stains on them. I told you about that before. Them sanctified clothes. And then he went to the tabernacle. Now, here's a model of what it's believed that the tabernacle looked like. Kind of simple. Kind of a simple structure, right? But he would go into the tabernacle, and he would collect 1 bull, 2 rams, and 2 goats. He would slaughter the bull as a sin offering for he and his family, because the first thing he had to do was make sure he was qualified to act as act in the atonement process for everybody else. So he would slaughter that bull, and then he would enter the Holy of Holies, which is inside the tabernacle. Here's the drawing of it. See it in there where that smoke is rising? He would enter there, and he would begin to burn incense in there. And the reason for that was they needed to have a cloud or a veil to protect them from God's presence. So they would begin to burn this incense, and it would make this cloud that would protect him. And then he would sprinkle some of the blood from that ram that he had sacrificed on the mercy seat as a typography of his and his family's own redemption. And then he went back out and he casted lots over these 2 goats. And he looked at the 2 goats, he would cast lots and say, okay, this one's for this one's for that. And one of those goats was sacrificed as a sin offering for the people. Right? So he would go back in, take some of that blood and sprinkle it on the mercy seat for the people, right? That meant the cleansing of the holies of holies. The Holy of Holies was completed. That part of the process. So he went back out, he used the blood from the bull and the goat to cleanse the altar. See the altar out front? So he cleansed that, and then he turned his attention to the second goat. And he literally went over to that goat, put his hands on the goat's head, right? Picture it? Right? And he laid the sins of the people on the head of the goat. He put the sins of the people on the goat. And then what did they do? They turned it out into the wilderness. You know where it was sent? It was sent to what's called the uninhabitable place. It was sent to the uninhabitable place. And then the priest would go in, he would remove his sacred garments, right? And then he would perform the burnt offerings. 1 ram for he and his family, 1 ram for the people. He completed the sacrifices from the earlier process. The fat from the animals was presented to the altar. Everything else was taken outside the camp and burned, right? And then everybody else, all the participants, cleaned themselves up, changed clothes, went home. And it was done. Now, why do I share that with you? Jesus is our ransom. He's our atonement. He's our sacrifice. He's our scapegoat. We all, like sheep, went astray. We have all turned to our own way. And the Lord has punished him or laid on him the iniquity of us all. God reached down and placed my sins on the head of Jesus. So it goes without saying, Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. Right? Jesus is my kinsman redeemer. He's my brother-in-law. I am a joint heir with him. And what does his provision provide for me? Listen, the kinsman redeemer is a big deal. It's more than just a name. It starts out with fiscal redemption. You ever been in debt? find yourself in debt to a price you can't pay? You owe more than you can cover? So you sell yourself into slavery, or you sell your land into slavery to pay for your debt? The kinsman redeemer's job was to come and redeem that. Buy you back out of slavery. Bring your land back out of slavery. So it's a fiscal redemption for debt, but it's also a familial redemption, or a descent thing, which is what we talked about today. From the first to the second Adam, there's been this process of sin in people. And that sin leads to death, and sometimes that death leads to a husband who passes before he can bear a child. So the kinsman redeemer's process was to come in and replace that father. We also have what I'm calling fault redemption. It's like a sin. You wronged somebody, you stole, you did this, you lied, you did that. A kinsman redeemer can also come in and replace or redeem you from your fault or your dereliction. You went above and beyond the law. You did something wrong, whatever that may happen to be. But the one that we're here to talk about is the final redemption. That's from death, right? That talks about the avenger of blood. In the Bible, it's called life for a life. Life for a life. One life for one life. Now picture this in your mind. One life for one life. The word for that is atonement. At one men. Life for a life. One to one. We're atoned with God. Our redemption was bought with a price. What was the price? We sang about it today. The precious blood of Jesus was the price for my redemption. His blood replaced my blood. He's my kinsman redeemer. His sacrifice replaced me. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have appointed it to you to make atonement on the altar for your lives, since it is the lifeblood that makes atonement. According to the law, almost everything is purified with what? With blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. So, what's the aim of this redemption? What's the aim of this process? You remember what atonement means? Remember what sacrifice means? It means what? To take a dirty, rotten, filthy, stinking sinner and clean them up so they can come into God's presence. Right? It's to bring us close to God. It's to bring me close to God. It's to bring you close to God and have the fullest enjoyment possible of our lives. I've said it 1,000 times and I'll say it again. This Christian gig's the best gig going. If it ain't knocking your socks off, you ain't doing it right. Right? That's what we're here to learn. And that's really the primary concept of redemption from the very beginning. And you would like to think, it would go without saying, that this type of a redemption, this type of a release from bondage should mean that we have an abundant life. Right? Wouldn't you think someone redeemed from all those types of things would have an abundant life? How's yours? How's mine? How's ours? We've been building the big idea. The take home. My redemption, right, is the primary principle of God's story. Mine. God redeeming me is the primary principle of His story. And it was purchased by the blood sacrifice of Christ. All right? Jesus is my ransom. I was taken hostage to sin. He bought me back. I was enslaved to sin. He bought me back. He's my brother. He can act in my place. Because where I'm weak and I don't have the resources, He's strong and He has all the resources. He can swoop in for me and act as my sacrifice, my redeemer, my defender. He's my avenger. He's my scapegoat. God reached down and put my sin on His head. And He took that sin to the uninhabitable place, otherwise known as hell. He's my kinsman redeemer. He's redeemed my soul. But you. Jesus wants to do all those things for you as well if He hasn't already. And if He has, and your life doesn't bear up to this wonderful gift that we've been given, you're like, man, I don't know why my life isn't more abundant. We're going to do things a little bit different today. Because hear me say this. Jesus Christ will redeem your broken body. He will redeem your broken existence. He will redeem you from your sin. He will give you at one-ment with God. We had an awesome Sunday last week. Some of you weren't able to be here, but it was unbelievable. Never seen it in the whole time of doing this, and God willing, we'll see it again. We had 4 families join the church last week, all at once. Something like, 16 people, I think. And it was such a bum rush for us, we kind of did some things well and some other things that we didn't do well. But from those 16, there's going to be 5 or 6 people that are going to be baptized, and we'd like to do that baptism this coming Sunday. So we're going to end our service a little bit differently today. We're going to come back up and we're going to do an altar call. We're going to do a song of invitation because I'm hoping that God's dealt with your heart this morning based on what I've tried to teach you. But also at the end of that, I'm just going to go back into the prayer room. If you don't know where the prayer room is, you go in through this door, you make a left, or you look to your left, and you'll see it right across the way. And I'm going to sit there and wait for anybody that needs me. I'm just going to go in there and sit and wait. If you need to talk to me, but walking this aisle is too much, or getting out and coming, I'll be there waiting for you. But I really want to talk to those 5 or 6 folks from last week who need baptism. There's a couple of children. There were some adults. So the 5 or 6 of you, or all of you, all of that those families, if there's anything that needs to be done from here on out, just meet me in there. We'll be quick. But I'm going to explain the plan of salvation to a couple of children and find out where they're at for baptism, okay? So that's what we're going to do. If you need me, I'll be in there. I don't know how I can make it any easier than that. But before we do that, we need to bring our corporate needs to God, right? Because everything Jesus has done for me, He'll do for you. Let me tell you, you can't be as bad as me.